The office was bathed in the soft glow of artificial light, and the stillness of the room was comforting. It was late, well past the time most of the staff had left, eager to start their weekends. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead blended with the quiet buzz of the computer on my desk, the only sounds accompanying the click of my fingers on the keyboard as I worked through the last few reports that had piled up during the week. The building, which was normally filled with the bustling energy of a corporate environment, felt different now, empty, but not desolate. The quiet brought a sense of calm, a rare solitude in a space that was usually so hectic. The glow from my desk lamp created a small, warm pool of light in the otherwise dim office. Outside, the city had already begun to wind down, the occasional sound of cars passing by muffled by the thick windows. I leaned back in my chair for a moment, stretching my arms and closing my eyes briefly to let the tension of the week melt away. It had been a long few days, and I could feel the weight of it in my shoulders. Yet there was a satisfaction in getting through it, knowing that I was handling my responsibilities well, that everything was falling into place. The quiet was soothing, almost meditative. With everyone gone, I could focus entirely on my work, my thoughts, and the soft rhythm of my typing. There was something comforting about being the last one in the office, as if it were a secret space just for me. The stacks of papers, the familiar scent of coffee lingering in the air from earlier in the day. It all felt like part of a routine I had come to know intimately. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that made the rest of the world seem far away, and for a few moments I felt entirely at ease. But then, the faint sound of footsteps broke the silence. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The office was usually deserted at this hour, the cleaning staff having already come and gone. But the sound grew louder, and my heart skipped a beat as I realized that someone else was still here. My eyes instinctively flicked toward the door, and for a moment, I wondered who it could be. Maybe someone had forgotten something, or maybe it was security doing a routine check. I tried to brush off the thought, returning to my work, but the sound of the footsteps echoed again, closer this time, and I couldn't ignore the prickling sensation of anticipation that crept up my spine. I glanced up from my screen just as the door swung open slowly, and my breath caught in my throat when I saw who it was. It was Mr. Davis. He stepped into the office with the same quiet confidence that had always made him stand out. He wasn't just any boss. He commanded attention without ever asking for it. And even now, in the stillness of the office, his presence filled the room in a way that made everything else feel small. His sharp features, the way he carried himself, always made me hyper-aware of his presence whenever he was around. But tonight, there was something different about him, something that sent a ripple of awareness through me. His usual polished appearance was slightly undone. The top few buttons of his crisp white shirt were left open, his tie loosened and hanging loosely around his neck. His suit jacket was missing, probably left on the back of his chair in his office, and his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, exposing the lean, strong lines of his forearms. It was rare to see him like this, less composed, more relaxed. The sight of him dressed down yet still so undeniably in control sent a shiver through me that I couldn't quite explain. For a moment, he simply stood there in the doorway, his eyes locking onto mine. There was no rush in his movements, no urgency in his steps. He was calm, collected. Yet the intensity of his gaze sent my heart racing. My fingers froze on the keyboard, my mind suddenly torn away from the reports in front of me. The quiet hum of the office, which had once been so comforting, now felt charged with an energy that hadn't been there just moments ago. Still here, his voice low and smooth broke the silence. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry as I tried to focus on keeping my composure. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just standing there looking at me. But there was something about the way his eyes lingered, the way he seemed so at ease yet so alert, that made my pulse quicken. It was the same feeling I got every time he entered a room, the subtle but undeniable shift of focus, like everything else blurred around the edges and all that remained clear was him. I nodded, my voice catching slightly as I responded. Just finishing up a few things. He stepped further into the room, the door clicking shut behind him, and I felt the space between us shrink. He moved with purpose, but there was a softness to his movements tonight, a relaxed air that I wasn't used to seeing from him. It made him feel more approachable. Yet at the same time, It heightened the tension that had always lingered just below the surface whenever we were alone. Mr. Davis moved toward my desk, his gaze never leaving mine. The distance between us seemed to dissolve as he approached, and I could feel the warmth of his presence before he even came close. He leaned casually against the edge of my desk, crossing his arms over his chest in a way that made him seem both relaxed and completely in control. I glanced down, unable to meet his eyes for too long, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't fully understand. "I didn't expect anyone else to be here," he said, his voice softer now, almost intimate. There was a hint of something in his tone, something I had sensed before but had always dismissed as my own overactive imagination. It was that same undercurrent that had been present in the way he sometimes looked at me during meetings, the way his hand had brushed against mine in passing just a little too long. It was subtle, always fleeting, and I had convinced myself time and time again that it was nothing. But now, standing this close to him, with the office so quiet, and the two of us alone, that subtle feeling had turned into something tangible, something I couldn't ignore. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my skin warming under his gaze. The soft scent of his cologne lingered in the air between us, mixing with the familiar smells of the office, paper, ink, and coffee. But it was his presence that filled the room. My thoughts, which had been focused on work just moments ago, were now tangled up in the realization that I wasn't imagining the tension between us. It was real, and it was undeniable. He looked down at me, his eyes softening, the edges of his lips curling into a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't his usual professional smile, the one he gave during meetings or when speaking to clients. This one was different, warmer, more personal. My breath hitched as I felt the weight of his attention settle on me, the air around us growing heavier. "You've been working hard," he said, his voice low, his eyes never leaving mine. "I've noticed." The compliment sent a shiver through me, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he said them. Softly, like a secret just between us. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, of the sudden shift between us. I had always admired him, always felt that strange flutter of nerves whenever he was near. But I had never expected this. This closeness, this quiet intensity that seemed to be pulling us together without either of us saying a word. He leaned in slightly, resting one hand on the desk beside me, his body now just inches away from mine. The closeness was overwhelming, the heat from his body radiating toward me, mixing with the warm light from the lamp. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, as I tried to keep my breathing steady, to remain composed. But the way he was looking at me, the way his presence seemed to fill every corner of the room, made it impossible to focus on anything else. I didn't know what to say. My mind felt blank, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in the dynamic between us. This was my boss, the person I had looked up to, admired, and respected, but now standing this close to him, with the quiet office wrapped around us like a cocoon. The lines between professionalism and something far more intimate were beginning to blur. The silence between us stretched out, thick with unspoken words, and I could feel the air between us crackling with anticipation. My breath hitched as I dared to meet his eyes again. And in that moment, everything else fell away. The reports, the office, the expectations, all that mattered was the pull between us. A pull that had been there for months, simmering beneath the surface, but had never been acknowledged. Until now. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing around us, shrinking the distance between Mr. Davis and me, until it was almost unbearable. The quiet hum of the office that had once been soothing now seemed to amplify the tension, making the silence between us feel heavier with every passing second. He was still leaning casually against my desk, but there was nothing casual about the way he looked at me. His eyes lingered, as if searching for something beneath the surface, and I could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical touch. I shifted slightly in my seat, my hands resting nervously on the edge of the desk, trying to focus on the reports in front of me, but my mind was elsewhere. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, so close now that the air between us seemed to pulse with the quiet electricity of something unspoken. It was the way his presence seemed to fill the room, making everything else, the papers, the dim light, the world outside, fade into the background. All I could focus on was him, His shirt was open just enough to catch a glimpse of skin at his collarbone, and the looseness of his tie made him seem more approachable, more human, yet somehow even more alluring. There had always been something about him that had drawn my attention, that unshakable aura of control and confidence that seemed to come so effortlessly to him. But now there was something else, something deeper and more intimate, as though the mask of professionalism he always wore had slipped just enough for me to glimpse the man underneath. And then he spoke again, his voice soft, almost gentle, but filled with a gravity that made my heart quicken. "You've been working hard," he said, his tone low but carrying a weight that felt far more personal than a simple acknowledgement of my efforts. "I've noticed," the compliment hung in the air between us, heavier than it should have been. It wasn't just what he said, but the way he said it, as though the words themselves carried more meaning than they were meant to. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. Compliments were not uncommon in a workplace, but this felt different. His voice wasn't just filled with the casual approval of a boss, recognizing a subordinate's hard work. There was something deeper beneath it, something more intimate that made the space between us feel charged with unspoken emotion. I looked up at him, my heart racing as I tried to gauge the intent behind his words. His eyes were locked on mine, dark and intense, and the air between us seemed to grow warmer, as though the compliment had shifted something in the atmosphere. It was like he had opened a door, revealing something between us that neither of us had been willing to confront before now. The way he was looking at me, the softness of his gaze, the almost imperceptible curl of his lips, it all spoke of something more than just professional admiration. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, a flush creeping up my neck as my mind raced to process the sudden shift. My pulse quickened, and I was acutely aware of the space between us. How small it was, how easy it would be to reach out, to close the distance that now seemed more like a chasm of desire waiting to be crossed. "You've been pushing yourself," he continued, his voice even lower now, almost a whisper, as though this conversation was meant for just the two of us, meant to stay in the private bubble of this dimly lit office. "I don't think I've thanked you enough." The words hit me like a wave, their impact far more profound than they should have been. It wasn't just gratitude. There was something about the way he said it, the way his voice dipped slightly, softening in a way that felt almost intimate. My breath hitched in my throat, and I could feel my body responding in ways I hadn't anticipated. My pulse quickening, my skin tingling under his gaze. His words were simple, but they carried a depth of emotion I wasn't prepared for, a quiet intensity that made my stomach twist with anticipation. There was no denying it now. The tension that had always simmered beneath the surface between us had broken free, spilling into the space between us with an intensity that made my chest tighten. The room felt charged, electric with possibilities that neither of us could ignore anymore. His eyes never left mine, and in that moment, it felt like we were both standing on the edge of something dangerous, something we couldn't come back from once we crossed it. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, each one more confusing than the last. Was this real? Was I imagining it? The way he looked at me, the way his voice had softened when he spoke to me, it felt real, like the culmination of months of stolen glances and unspoken words. But it also felt impossible, like something I shouldn't allow myself to believe. Yet there he was, standing so close I could feel the heat from his body, the quiet intensity in his gaze pulling me in. His hand was resting on the desk just inches from mine, and I couldn't help but notice the way his fingers flexed slightly, as though he was holding himself back, resisting the urge to close the distance between us. There was a long pause, a silence filled with everything we weren't saying, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I waited for him to speak again, to break the tension that was now crackling like electricity in the air. But he didn't. Instead, he just stood there, his eyes locked on mine, his body close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him, the scent of his cologne lingering in the air between us. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just in my head. This wasn't just a fleeting feeling or an overactive imagination. The connection between us, the pull that had been simmering for so long, was real, and we both felt it. My breath hitched as I looked up at him, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. There was no denying it anymore. The compliment he had given me, simple though it was, had changed everything. It was the key that had unlocked something between us, something we had both been too afraid to acknowledge until now. And as we stood there, the air thick with anticipation, I realized that there was no going back. The line between us had been crossed, and now we were standing on the other side, waiting to see what would happen next. The space between us was impossibly small, and yet it felt vast, as if we were standing on opposite sides of a line we had been too scared to cross. The soft glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows across the room, making everything feel more intimate, more dangerous. The tension that had built between us over the past few months was now palpable, thick in the air, hanging between us, like a thread waiting to snap. I could feel my pulse quicken, the blood rushing in my ears, my skin prickling with the awareness of how close he was, how easily he could reach out, and how desperately I wanted him to. I had never been more aware of the silence in the room, the hum of the lights above, the distant murmur of the city outside, and our breathing. The only sounds filling the space, yet each one seemed to amplify the weight of the moment. Mr. Davis hadn't moved, but his presence was overwhelming, the quiet intensity of his gaze making my heart pound in my chest. I tried to steady myself, to focus on something, anything, that could ground me. But the pull between us was undeniable. Every inch of me was attuned to him, waiting for the inevitable, the moment when everything would change. I wasn't sure who moved first, whether it was him, leaning in ever so slightly, or if it was me, drawn in by the force of whatever was pulling us together. But suddenly his hand was there, brushing against mine. The touch was featherlight, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to send a jolt through me like electricity shooting through my veins. My breath caught in my throat, and my fingers froze beneath his, unable to move, unable to process the rush of sensations that followed. It was just a touch, but it was everything. His fingers lingered, hovering just above mine, the warmth of his skin seeping into mine. The air around us seemed to thicken, the weight of the moment pressing down on us as the unspoken tension finally began to break. My heart was racing, pounding against my ribs, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, a flush of adrenaline and desire that I could no longer suppress. His touch was careful at first, hesitant as if he was testing the waters, unsure of whether I would pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, caught in the magnetic pull of his presence, my entire body buzzing with the anticipation of what was to come. His fingers slid just a little closer, brushing more deliberately against mine, and I felt the world tilt beneath me. The touch was so simple, so innocent on the surface, but it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said, everything we had kept hidden. In that small, quiet moment, the line between us dissolved. The months of stolen glances, the unspoken feelings that had simmered just beneath the surface, they all led to this. His touch wasn't just a touch, it was a promise, an unspoken admission of everything we had been too afraid to acknowledge until now. It was the crack in the wall we had built between us, the moment where we both knew there was no going back. His hand remained there, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of mine, and I could feel the tension between us shift. It was no longer the uncomfortable weight of unsaid words, but something more intimate, something filled with possibility. My breath hitched and I dared to glance up at him, my heart stuttering when I saw the look in his eyes. The intensity was still there, but now it was softer, more vulnerable, like he had finally let his guard down. His gaze was locked on mine, and in his eyes, I saw everything he wasn't saying. The desire, the longing, the fear of crossing a line that neither of us could uncross. And yet there was something else too, something deeper. There was a gentleness in the way he touched me, as if he was trying to reassure me that we were in this together, that whatever happened next, we would face it as one. My mind was spinning, racing with 1,000 thoughts that I couldn't put into words. I knew this was a risk. I knew that crossing this line, breaking the tension between us, would change everything. Our professional relationship, the way we interacted in the office, even the way we saw each other. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All I could think about was the way his touch made me feel, the way his fingers lingered on mine like a secret only we shared. I swallowed hard, my throat dried, and without thinking, I shifted my hand slightly, turning it so that my fingers brushed against his. The movement was subtle, but it was enough to close the gap, enough to show him that I wasn't pulling away, that I wanted this as much as he did. His breath hitched, just barely audible, and I saw the flicker of something. Relief, maybe? He moved closer then, just a fraction, the space between us shrinking even more. I could feel the heat of his body now, the warmth radiating from him, and it made my pulse quicken, made my skin tingle with the anticipation of what would come next. His hand still resting on the desk beside mine, shifted, his fingers brushing more deliberately against my skin. The contact sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a rush of heat flood my chest, my stomach twisting with the realization of just how much I wanted this. The world outside the office ceased to exist. The reports, the deadlines, the professional boundaries that had once kept us apart, they all melted away in the face of this quiet, undeniable moment. It was just us now, standing on the edge of something new, something neither of us could control. The air between us was charged with the weight of everything we had been holding back, and with that first touch, we had finally let it all come crashing down. For a moment, neither of us moved. We simply stood there, suspended in the silence, our hands brushing, our eyes locked, both of us waiting for the other to make the next move. The tension had broken, but the anticipation remained, thick and heavy in the air. I could feel the pull between us, the magnetic force that had been there all along, now stronger than ever. And then slowly, deliberately, he leaned in just a little closer, his breath warm against my skin. His hand, now more confident, rested fully over mine, his fingers curling slightly, holding me in place. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I was caught in the moment, caught in him, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to hold back. The tension was gone, but what remained was even more intense. The quiet, undeniable connection between us, finally free from the boundaries we had tried so hard to maintain. And as we stood there, our hands entwined, the world outside forgotten, I knew that we had crossed the line, and there was no going back. The moment his hand fully covered mine, the world seemed to narrow, focusing down to just the two of us. Everything else, the reports on my desk, the hum of the office, the weight of the expectations we'd been carrying, faded into the background. It was like stepping into a bubble where time slowed and all that existed was the electric charge between us. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it loud in my ears, each beat a reminder of how far we'd already come. His hand was warm, his touch steady but tentative, as though he was giving me a chance to pull away, to signal that this was a line we shouldn't cross. But I didn't. I couldn't. Every nerve in my body was focused on him, his presence, the subtle scent of his cologne, the quiet way his breath hitched when our hands touched. I had spent months trying to suppress the feelings that now surged through me, and the force of them left me dizzy, breathless. Mr. Davis shifted closer, just a fraction, but it was enough to send a wave of heat through me. I could feel the warmth radiating off his body, and the distance between us, barely an inch now, felt like the most fragile of barriers. His eyes flickered down to my lips, and for the briefest moment, I saw a hesitation in his gaze, a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. This was a moment neither of us had planned for, but one we both seemed helpless to stop. The tension between us wasn't just about desire anymore. It was a silent acknowledgement of everything we had been holding back. The room seemed to pulse with the quiet anticipation of what was about to happen. My breath hitched, my fingers instinctively curling beneath his, and that small movement was all it took. His eyes met mine again, and in that shared look, everything changed. He moved closer, his face inches from mine, and the air around us grew impossibly thick. My pulse raced, the sensation dizzying, as I felt the heat of his breath brushing against my skin. I could see the internal battle playing out in his eyes, the restraint he had been clinging to unraveling with every second that passed. And then, as if something inside him finally broke free, he leaned in and closed the distance between us. The kiss was soft at first, almost hesitant, like he was testing the waters, unsure of how I would respond. His lips barely grazed mine, the contact so light it felt like a whisper, but it was enough to set my entire body alight. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, momentarily overwhelmed by the rush of sensations that flooded through me. I could feel the steady beat of his heart against my chest, the warmth of his body pressing against mine. And for a second, it felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. But then something inside me shifted. The hesitation that had held me back melted away, replaced by an urgent, undeniable need to be closer to him. My hands, which had been resting limply on the desk, reached up almost of their own accord, fingers sliding up his chest and over the crisp fabric of his shirt. I could feel the solidness of him beneath my palms, the rise and fall of his breath matching my own, and the sense of rightness in the moment took over. As soon as I kissed him back, everything changed. The kiss deepened, the soft, tentative exploration giving way to something far more intense. His hands, still resting on mine, tightened slightly, pulling me closer, and I felt his other hand slide up my arm, leaving a trail of warmth in its wake. It was like a floodgate had opened. All the feelings we'd been trying to hold back now rushing to the surface in an overwhelming wave. His lips moved against mine with a sense of urgency, as though he had been waiting for this moment for as long as I had. And now that it was here, he couldn't hold back. The world outside the office disappeared. The only thing that mattered was the way he made me feel, alive, electrified, like every inch of my body was suddenly hyper-aware of him. His hand slipped from my arm to the small of my back, pulling me even closer until there was no space left between us. I could feel the heat of him, the steady strength of his body pressing against mine, and it made my head spin, my thoughts scattering in every direction. It wasn't just a kiss. It was an unspoken confession, a release of all the emotions we had kept hidden beneath layers of professionalism. Every brush of his lips against mine, every movement of his hands was a silent declaration of what we had both been too afraid to admit out loud. The kiss wasn't gentle anymore. It was filled with the intensity of months of suppressed feelings, of stolen glances and fleeting touches that had led us to this point. My hand slid up to his neck, fingers tangling in the soft hair at the nape, and I felt him shiver under my touch. There was something intoxicating about the way he responded to me, the way his body seemed to melt into mine, as though he had been waiting for this as long as I had. His lips pressed harder against mine, more insistent now, and I could feel the tension in him, the way he was holding himself back even as the kiss deepened. It was as if he couldn't get enough, and neither could I. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching out as we lost ourselves in the kiss. The office, the late hour, the reality of our situation, it all faded into the background, drowned out by the quiet hunger that had taken over. His hands roamed my body, exploring with a confidence that made my pulse race, and I could feel the heat pooling low in my stomach, the kind of heat that left me breathless, desperate for more. But even as the kiss grew more intense, there was a tenderness beneath it, a quiet care in the way he held me, as though he was still afraid that this moment might slip away if he wasn't careful. I could feel the conflict in him, the way he was trying to balance the intensity of his desire with the knowledge of what this kiss meant for both of us. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch up with what had just happened. The room felt charged with the aftermath of our kiss, the air heavy with the tension that had finally broken. His hands were still on my waist, holding me close, and I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin, the steady rise and fall of his chest as he tried to calm his breathing. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to break the fragile connection that had formed between us in that kiss. But I knew as we stood there, pressed close together in the dim light of the office, that nothing would be the same after this. The kiss lingered in the air, long after our lips had parted. Its echo felt in every heartbeat and every shallow breath. I could still feel the warmth of Mr. Davis's body pressed against mine, the memory of his hands on my waist, his breath mixing with mine in the stillness of the office. But now, as reality began to seep back in, the weight of what had just happened started to settle in the pit of my stomach. We had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed, and the enormity of that realization was impossible to ignore. For a few moments, we stayed close, our foreheads resting together, both of us trying to catch our breath. The room around us felt different now, no longer just a quiet office after hours, but the sight of something forbidden, something that felt both exhilarating and terrifying all at once. The silence between us was thick with the implications of what we had done, and though neither of us spoke, I could feel the gravity of it in the way his hands lingered on my waist, his touch hesitant, as if he was reluctant to let go. I stepped back slightly, just enough to create a sliver of space between us, and the cool air rushed in to fill the void where his body had been. The absence of his warmth was jarring, a sharp reminder of the boundary we had just shattered. I glanced up at him, my heart still racing, and saw the same mix of emotions mirrored in his eyes. Desire, yes, but also something else. A flicker of uncertainty, of fear, perhaps, at the reality of what we had just done. This was no longer just a fleeting attraction or a moment of weakness. This was real, and we both knew it. The office, once a neutral space where we had maintained our professional roles, now felt fraught with the consequences of that kiss. The desk, the reports, the dim light, they all seemed to take on new meaning, reminders of the boundaries we had crossed and the lines we had blurred. There was no going back to the way things had been. We had entered uncharted territory, and neither of us knew what the next step would look like. I could feel the tension in my chest, the weight of the unspoken questions that hung between us. What happens now? How do we face each other after this? My mind raced with the possibilities, each one more complicated than the last. This wasn't just about us. It was about everything that came with it. Our work, our reputations, the delicate balance we had to maintain in a professional environment that wasn't built to handle the kind of emotions we had just unleashed. I looked at him again, trying to read his expression. His jaw was tense, his eyes still dark with the remnants of the kiss. But there was something else there too, something deeper, more conflicted. He was grappling with the same thoughts I was, the same realization that our actions had consequences that went beyond just the two of us. There was no way to undo what had happened, no way to return to the safe, professional distance we had once maintained, and that thought sent a ripple of anxiety through me. The risk was undeniable. There was the practical side of things, our positions within the company, the way we interacted with each other on a daily basis, the subtle power dynamics that had always existed between us. But now those dynamics had shifted, and the precariousness of it all was clear. If anyone found out, if word spread about what had happened between us, the repercussions could be severe. It wasn't just about reputations. It was about the very structure of the workplace, the balance of authority that had kept everything in check. And yet, beneath all that anxiety, there was another layer, one that was far more personal. It wasn't just the professional consequences that weighed on me. It was the fear of what this kiss meant for us, for the connection we had just exposed. The desire between us had always been there, simmering beneath the surface. But now that it had been acted on, there was no way to pretend it didn't exist. The intensity of the kiss, the way his hands had gripped me like he didn't want to let go, had made it clear that this wasn't just a passing moment of weakness. It was something deeper, something neither of us could easily ignore. I could feel the pulse of that desire still thrumming beneath the surface, even as the reality of the situation weighed heavily on my mind. The kiss had been more than just physical. It had been a release of everything we had kept bottled up for so long. The attraction, the tension, the quiet moments of connection that had grown over time. But now that it was out in the open, it was dangerous. It was real. The silence between us stretched on, filled with the weight of what we weren't saying. I could feel the questions swirling in my mind, each one more complicated than the last. How were we supposed to go back to the way things had been? Could we? Or had we crossed a line that had fundamentally changed everything between us? I didn't have the answers, and from the look in his eyes, I knew he didn't either. Mr. Davis finally exhaled, the tension in his posture softening just slightly, though his gaze remained steady on mine. His hand, which had been resting on the edge of the desk, flexed as though he was considering reaching out to me again, but he hesitated. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the battle between wanting to close the distance between us again, and knowing that doing so would only complicate things further. He didn't move, though, and neither did I. We stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on us, and I realized that this was the turning point. The kiss had changed everything, but now came the real test. What we did next. How we handled the aftermath of this moment would define everything. There was a part of me that wanted to give in to the pull between us, to ignore the consequences, and let myself be swept away by the intensity of what we had shared. But I knew it wasn't that simple. There was no escaping the reality of what we had done. We couldn't pretend that this kiss hadn't happened, but at the same time, we couldn't ignore the consequences that came with it. The lines between us had blurred, but now we had to figure out how to navigate this new terrain without losing ourselves or each other in the process. As we stood in the dimly lit office, the weight of our actions heavy between us, I felt a quiet determination settle in my chest. We had crossed the line, yes, but now we had to face what that meant. Whatever came next, we couldn't run from it. The consequences of our kiss were real, but so was the connection between us. And that, more than anything, was what terrified me. Because once you crossed a line like this, there was no going back. The days that followed the kiss were a blur of emotions, a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts that left me feeling disoriented. The line we had crossed hung between us, invisible but ever present, changing the dynamic of every interaction. I woke each morning with a sense of anticipation and dread, unsure of what the day would bring, unsure of how we would navigate the fragile new territory we found ourselves in. It was strange how, on the surface, nothing seemed different. The office was still the same. The paperwork, the meetings, the daily routine that had once been comforting in its predictability. But underneath, everything had shifted. Each glance between us carried the weight of what had happened. The kiss that ignited something we could no longer ignore. We were still trying to pretend that we could handle it, that we could find a way to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But the tension was there, lurking beneath every conversation, every look, every moment we shared alone. I found myself hyper-aware of his presence in a way that I hadn't been before. It wasn't just attraction anymore, though that was still there, stronger than ever. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. It was the knowledge that we had stepped into a space where nothing was certain anymore. The kiss had opened a door, but what lay beyond it was unclear, and I wasn't sure if either of us knew how to move forward. The first morning after, I had arrived at the office early, hoping to avoid any awkward run-ins. The empty cubicles and the soft hum of the early morning lights gave me a false sense of calm, as if the silence could somehow undo what had happened, could somehow return things to the way they were. But as soon as I saw him, that illusion shattered. He walked into the office with his usual confident stride, but the moment his eyes met mine, everything stilled. There was a pause, brief but heavy, as if we were both waiting for the other to make the first move, to acknowledge what had happened or to pretend it hadn't. My pulse quickened, my hands instinctively reaching for something, anything, to anchor myself, as if the stack of papers in front of me could provide the stability I suddenly lacked. He offered a small nod, his expression unreadable, and we fell into the routine of the day, both of us skirting around the elephant in the room. It was easier in the beginning, pretending that nothing had changed. We moved through our tasks, exchanged the usual polite conversation, but there was a new undercurrent in everything we did. Every time our eyes met, it was like we were walking a tightrope, balancing precariously between the desire that had always been there and the fear of what would happen if we gave into it again. It wasn't just the fear of being caught, though that fear lingered, sharp and ever-present. It was the fear of what this meant for us, for our relationship. We had crossed a line, and now we were left to figure out what that meant. The uncertainty gnawed at me, keeping me awake at night, my mind spinning with possibilities, none of them clear. What were we now? Colleagues? Something more? We hadn't talked about it, and that silence was its own kind of tension. The quiet moments we shared were the hardest, when the office was empty, or when we found ourselves alone in the elevator. The air between us would thicken, the memory of the kiss hanging there like an unspoken promise. There was an unspoken agreement between us not to talk about it, as if naming it would make it real, make it impossible to ignore. But the silence couldn't hold forever, and I could feel the weight of it building with each passing day. I could see it in the way he looked at me, the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long when he thought I wasn't paying attention. He was trying to maintain control, just as I was, but the connection between us had already broken through that control, and it was only a matter of time before it broke through again. The uncertainty of it all was like a constant hum in the back of my mind, a reminder that we were treading dangerous ground. And yet, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, there was a thrill to it too, a quiet, forbidden excitement that buzzed beneath the surface, making my skin tingle whenever he was near. Every brush of his hand, every accidental touch, sent a shiver through me, a reminder of how easily we could fall back into that moment. The kiss had changed everything, yes, but it had also awakened something in both of us, something that neither of us seemed willing to fully confront but couldn't entirely ignore. One afternoon, weeks after the kiss, we found ourselves alone again, this time in the conference room after a long meeting. The office was quiet, most of the staff having left for the day, and the setting sun cast a warm glow across the table where we sat, reviewing the details of a project that seemed trivial in comparison to the storm of emotions swirling between us. I could feel the tension building again, the air thick with the same unspoken desire that had simmered between us since that night. He was sitting close, too close, and I could smell the faint scent of his cologne, could feel the heat of his body radiating toward me. My hands shook slightly as I flipped through the papers in front of me, trying to focus on the task at hand. But my mind kept drifting back to that kiss, to the way his lips had felt against mine, to the way his hands had gripped me as if he couldn't let go. He was quiet, his gaze fixed on the documents in front of him, but I knew he felt it too. The tension between us was palpable, like a rubber band stretched too tight, ready to snap at any moment. I could see the flicker of something in his eyes when he glanced at me. Something dark, something hungry, and it made my heart race, made my skin flush with the memory of how easily we had fallen into each other before. But this time, we didn't give in. Not yet. Instead, we lingered in the silence, both of us aware of what could happen, both of us holding back. The uncertainty was still there, heavy and oppressive, but so was the pull. We were standing on the edge of something we didn't fully understand, something that scared us, but we couldn't turn back now. The line had been crossed, and no matter how hard we tried to pretend otherwise, we both knew there was no going back to the way things had been. The future was unclear, filled with questions neither of us had the courage to ask. What were we to each other now? Could we maintain this delicate balance, or would the tension between us break, pulling us under once again? The answers remained elusive, hidden in the spaces between our words. But one thing was certain. We weren't done. The kiss had opened the door to something deeper, something neither of us could walk away from now. As the evening shadows lengthened and the office grew darker, I glanced at him, feeling the weight of the moment settle between us. The uncertainty was still there, a constant companion, but so was the undeniable connection that had brought us here. Whatever happened next, we would face it together, step by step, navigating the unknown with equal parts fear and desire. And for now, that was enough.